enlighten us, save us from ourselves. This country.
I would like to say thank you very much to the Free Market Foundation for inviting me to talk about Nigeria's experience with property rights over the last few decades. So while Nigeria may not have undergone the same challenges and the same problems that South Africa has in the last few years, and while the underlying factors that have led to the discussions about the expropriation without compensation may be different from the situation in Nigeria, there are several similarities between the causalities. So the country went through a similar phase in 1978. Before 1978, Nigeria had a freehold system where property was owned by individuals through several means, such as community laws, transfer of ownership, or even forceful dispossession. And with regards to forceful dispossession, this was not government forcefully dispossessing land. This was an understanding before colonialism that warring ethnic groups could forcefully dispossess lands from ethnic groups that they conquer. So this was the system before 1979. However, the former military president or military head of state, Olusegun Obasanjo, in 1979 made moves to introduce the 1979 Land Use Decree, which basically gave all control of all land in the country to the government. This meant that there was an overriding of all existing land ownership in the whole country. And the government became the legal custodian of all land and also had the power to authorize distribution of land in Nigeria. They can revoke, the government, the federal government that is, Nigerian federal government can revoke land ownership with and without compensation, depending on the before 1978, there were different forms of land transfer and the transfer of ownership. And however, aside from, there was an exception though. The public land used by the British colonialists, most of the land were, apart from those, most of the other land were held by individuals who held these pieces of land on behalf of their families or their communities. So inherently, land was basically owned by individuals, and this was absolute. They owned the land. As a step to make land distribution more efficient, supposedly more efficient, the Act abolished the freehold system entirely and transfer of ownership to the government. What was introduced was a leasehold system where everyone who had the freehold, who had total ownership of the land, now became tenants to the government for 99 years. This meant that after 99 years, the government would review the ownership of your land and decide whether to give you an extension or not give you an extension. So this basically meant that the government created an illusion of ownership. It meant that Nigerians moved from actually owning land to having the illusion of ownership, because now they became landowners and then they became tenants to the government. The objective of the Land Use Act was given then as to effectively restructure change or structural change in the system and to achieve fast economic and social transformation. I'll come to that in a bit, if the government did achieve that or not. And also to negate economic inequality caused by appropriation of rising land values. The result of the 1978 Land Use Decree made it possible to transfer land in two forms, basically through a certificate of occupancy. This is an instrument that the state governors and local government chairmen, or the local government chairman, the equivalent of that would be the city mayor, for example, have the rights, or are the ones who have the rights to issue certificate of occupancy. And these certificates are the highest level of authority, to prove that you have some form of ownership of property, of land in Nigeria. Then there's also the deed of assignment, which someone who has a certificate of occupancy can sell a bit of his parcel of land to someone else and issue a deed of assignment, which also has to be approved by the governor, which is called the governor's consent. So it means that every single trade or transaction of property in Nigeria has to go through the state governor. The state governor has to physically, or in certain places, digitally sign and approve that transaction. Since 1978, when this was introduced, 40 years after, only 3% of the land in Nigeria is registered. 3%. This means that 97% of the land in Nigeria is not registered with the government. And this brings me to the presentation that Baron Mitra gave about India, and we talked about how this dispossesses the poor of access to move up the ladder. Because if 97% of Nigerians do not have their property registered with the government, it gives room for the government to dispossess their property at will, because they do not have any form of legal documentation to prove that they own that property. The reasons for this poor number, this poor 3% of all the land in Nigeria being registered are numerous. One of them is ignorance. Many people do not really understand why they need to ask the government to authorize or to give them some form of documentation to prove that they own that property, because they believe it's theirs. Illiteracy is also part of that. Inadequate regulation and policy guidelines. The policy guidelines are very cumbersome. Also, the prohibitive cost of registering your land with the government or your property with the government is it's very expensive and out of the reach of most Nigerians. And this also means, because most property are situated in the rural area, and means that most of Nigeria's poor cannot effectively prove that they own their property, even though they've owned that property for decades, or they've owned the property for centuries. They cannot effectively prove that that property belongs to them. Realistically, while people who possess titles of land can assume ownership, so even the 3% who can assume ownership or who have the illusion of ownership, the government still has the rights, remains the only true owner of land in Nigeria, because they can take away the land at any point in time, however the governor deems fit. The governor, every state governor is basically the true land owner in that state, not Nigerians. So this has affected Nigeria in a lot of ways, one of which is Nigeria's score on the Property Rights Index. Nigeria scores 35 on the Property Rights Index and standing at the 31st country out of 48 African countries on the index, which is a sub-component of the Index of Economic Freedom. The Property Rights Index measures the rights and the degree to which a country's laws protects private property. And over the last few years, Nigeria has declined on that index. The major problem of this system, the property rights system in Nigeria, and the fact that the government truly owns all the land in the country, are enormous. And the Nigerians who face most of the negative consequences of this are actually Nigeria's poor. The rich are able to circumvent because they have the money to prove ownership of whatever property that they have. It's not too expensive, to them. But the poor are the ones who cannot access capital, cannot use their property as barter or to exchange or to get a loan in bank because they do not have access to documents that prove that they have ownership of that piece of land. In cases where they do have the money, where they're able to raise the money, work tirelessly and save a lot of money, raise a lot of money to register, enough to register their property, they are faced by humongous bureaucratic processes that dissuades them from actually going through to register that property. What that means is that they cannot climb up, they cannot improve their lives because of these barriers that already exist. Although the Nigerian government barely takes land, and in actual fact, while doing this research, I talked to a few people. The Nigerian government barely takes land from owners without compensation. What the government will do, even though they have a right under the law to take land, dispossess people without compensation, the government would give a token, which is a very meager amount of money, just so as not to create a lot of resentment, when they want to dispossess people of land. They give a token which is not basically what they consider to be the value of the land, which is not necessarily the market value of that property. So it means that the government or the governor can assign any random amount of money to, to any Nigerian who is being dispossessed of his property. The right or the compensation is usually not the true market value of the property, except you have a friend in government where you can influence how much you get paid back when the government dispossesses you of your property. So this also involves a lot of corruption. Since the government has the power to revoke land in the country, the value of the land as collateral in trade becomes very, very reduced. It's less defensible. Because if the government is the true owner of your property, when you want to exchange your property for a loan, for example, or you want to use it as collateral, because you're not the true owner of it, it becomes a less defensible document. Even if you have the title deeds, it becomes a less defensible document for you to get a loan. No one also wants to make an exchange where they are getting, the property that they're getting can be stripped away by a third party at any time. Also, the fact that Nigerians are basically leasing their property from the government for 99 years, the more a property moves towards the 99-year mark, say, for example, a young Nigerian inherits a parcel of land from his parents, and the parcel of land was registered 70 years ago, 80 years ago. The closer you get to the 99-year mark, the less value the property is worth, because it's close to the time where the government can easily dispossess you of the land. They decide whether to extend your rights to that property or to cancel your rights to the property. So it means that within 2 generations, a property that remains in a family can easily be dispossessed by the government if they will. It's basically the government's call. Because of the humongous, very expensive cost of registering property in Nigeria, the lands cost more than they should, actual market value. The cost of obtaining title deeds most of the time is about 15% of the value of that property. So it means that if you buy a property of of 100,000 naira, you should expect to pay 15% of that property in taxes to the government. And the cost rises also from the fact that there are a lot of middlemen who sometimes are illegal. Touts, secure, your land is not secure because, the government can take it away. Touts can disrupt you from building your properties and stuff like that. And all of these add to the rising cost of procuring or purchasing property in the country. So because of this faulty land ownership system, since most land are unregistered in Nigeria, land dispute is very common. And because of the land disputes that are very common, a lot of people profit from the illegal transaction or sales of land. If you do not have documents, if the document, the registration system is fraught with a lot of inconsistencies, people begin to profit. Some people begin to profit from that loophole. Due to the poor absence of documentation, owners of land find it difficult to access formal services as well. In addition to this, the ability to prove ownership of a piece of land remains a nightmare to landowners in the country, and they cannot be properly compensated for the property that they duly own. This is a big challenge, and as a country with a lot of mineral resources, the government, basically, if you, for example, you find a rare mineral on your parcel of land, you should rather keep quiet about it and not let the government know, because the government will be right in front of your door to take your property away from you. This comes as a cost to citizens during economic activities. And the first option is that the government, for us to move towards a better system in Nigeria, it is important that the government, first and foremost, deregulates the land tenure system in the country. And people should not ideally need the consent of the government to transfer landed property, just like they do not need the consent of the government to transfer other properties. They should have full claim to their property, and the processes of obtaining title deeds and certificate of occupancy should be as simple and not as cumbersome as it currently is. What we need to do in Nigeria is basically an overhaul of the 1978 Land Use Act and not an amendment whatsoever. It's basically an holistic review of the entire land registration process in the country and property rights in the country as well. The fact that this is a foundation of the Land Use Act remains fundamentally critical, and this should be revisited. It is important that one way to go about this is to digitalize some of the processes in the country. If you go to many of the ministries of lands in all the states, in 36 states in Nigeria, you would find that most of this is still done very manually in files and folders on shelves, and none of this is actually digitized. For Nigeria to move forward as economically, we need to free up this capital, dead capital. Access to land needs to be, access to documents that prove that you own your property need to be made simpler for Nigerians, so that that's the best way to get poor Nigerians out of the labyrinth of poverty that they've moved around over the last few decades. The best way to go about this is to improve property rights, and I believe that some of the experience of Nigeria with our poor property rights system will serve as a lesson to South Africa as you consider the proposal to expropriate land without compensation. I believe that South Africans will stand up to the government and express their displeasure about the way in which the conversation about expropriating land without compensation has been going. Thank you very much. I hope you learn from Nigeria.